Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture for our Spring 2022 MA Aesthetics and Politics lecture series. My name's Amanda Beach, and I'm the Dean of the School of Critical Studies and also faculty on the MA Aesthetics and Politics programme, where this series is part of our core curriculum. And first, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, our speakers, you, the audience out there, for tuning in when you've probably got a very busy day or evening, depending on what time zone you're living in. And I'd also like to thank our valued people in technical support who are making this live stream happen right now. And I hope you'll find this series of talks thought-provoking enough that some of you will add your questions to the live stream chat on the YouTube channel that you're watching on as we go on, and I can mediate your questions back to our speakers. So do populate that stream with questions, and you will be heard and spoken to as we go forward. The format for this series is 3 sets of talks, each featuring one main speaker and a respondent. Just to let you know that our next session will be held on March the 17th, and the last one will be April the 7th, and they all start at the same time. In those next sessions, we'll be welcoming G. Marino from the ICA Miami and Jaleh Mansour as his respondent. And then in the final session, we'll have Tony Bogues from Brown University and James Trafford as the respondent for that session. And today, I've got great pleasure in welcoming Katerina Kolozova and Alice Lucy Rekab as the respondent. Katerina will talk for around 40 minutes, and then that will be followed by Alice's response. And then we'll have quite a few minutes to open this out for you, the audience, for a larger discussion. And just as a reminder, as you probably see from the image behind me, that each semester we explore a different topic. And this spring, we'll be discussing this theme, dominance and revolution, and the subtitle, The Image, the Struggle, and the Use of Force. And I'm just going to say something very briefly about that to introduce this series. Themes of dominance and revolution are not so popular today. The idea of a comprehensive reorientation of our world is claimed to be impossible, and the notion that there is a visible concentration of power that might be called dominant has sometimes been eviscerated by neoliberal global capital, as much as by the disaggregating mechanics of critical theory, which is preferred to speak about horizontal forms of power as opposed to verticality. In such case, the question of our social and political future has been described as open, but also limited. Accordingly, on the one hand, we are told that there are no grounds, no givens, no truth, which seems to hold the promise of open possibilities. But on the other hand, these possibilities struggle to be free from the conventions and habits that not only define the condition of capitalism, but also constrain us to its ontology. We are limited then by our own diagnosis of the past, made through our assessment of our political failures, but also by our beliefs and the development of ideologies that have taken the place of facts. The legacy of this has left us today in the scene of a post-tragic failure, a failure to imagine a world that is capable of being extracted from the one we currently inhabit. In this sense, capital defeats the we, critique has demolished the future, and both have defeated the truth. In this series, we will explore the possibility of theorizing, thinking, and picturing the relations of the past, present, and the future in a constructive sense. To do so, we must take into account the history of resistance that has defined art, critique, and the leftist struggle for emancipatory power. But also for our discussion, we must deal with the theme of transcendence once more, so as to engage the question of what is real difference. Here we can ask about the role and force of the image in this project, the validity of speaking about the class struggle, the role of critique, and reason for class consciousness, as well as race and equality, and notwithstanding the question of a politics that can rethink the human, the subject, and the we. when today these universal elements are extirpated in the subliminal negativity of identity politics, neo-expressivism, as well as in critiques from the right and the left, we can ask what it is to understand, communicate and picture the political, one that can delve into the complex that is initiated by negativity and constructive affirmation. So there's lots to think about there, obviously, and I'm so pleased to be able to have here Dr. Katerina Kolozova, because I know Katerina's work speaks directly and indirectly to a lot of these questions that we've posed for this season. Katerina is senior researcher and professor at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje, and visiting faculty at Arizona State University Center for Philosophical Technologies. At the Faculty of Media and Communications, Belgrade, she teaches contemporary political philosophy. Professor Kolozova was a visiting scholar at the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley in 2009, and a Columbia University NYSIPA visiting scholar at its Paris Global Center in 2019 as well. She is a member of the board of directors of the New Center for Research and Practice, Seattle, and co-director of the School of Materialist Research. Kolozova is the author of Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, a non-Marxist critique of capital, Philosophy and Patriarchy, published by Bloomsbury Academic UK in 2019, and Cut of the Real, Subjectivity and Post-Structuralist Philosophy, by Columbia University Press in 2014. And Katerina's respondent today is Dr. Alice Rekab, who is an artist, researcher, and educator based in Dublin in Ireland. Their practice is concerned with expressions and iterations of complex cultural and personal narratives. Alice takes their own mixed-race Irish identity as a starting point from which to explore experiences of race, place, and belonging. Over the last 10 years, Alice's practice has centered around collaboration and interdisciplinary work, from which they produce film, performance, text, image, and sculpture, creating new intersectional narratives and objects for gallery-based exhibition and large-scale public commission. So, with that introduction, and with those biographies in mind, I'd just like to thank our speakers again for joining us today. And I'm going to retire for a while and hand over the baton to Katerina. So thank you, Katerina, and welcome again.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks also for having me as part of the regular curriculum previously with your group of MA students. That was also a very gratifying experience. So I think that I will, in a way, build on some of the questions that we opened up there through this presentation of mine. I have subtitled or in a way described the trajectory of my presentation here through this very lengthy subtitle in order to kind of give a certain map of concepts that will help those who listen to this talk follow the argument with more ease, as the paper is rather dense. So this very descriptive subtitle reads as follows: in defense of mechanicity, coarse materiality, and Technē as the route to materialism as imagined by Marx and its non-anthropocentric radical humanism or non-humanism in Laruellian sense. So post-humanism beyond the post-structuralist paradigm. So this will be one of the threads that leads what is the obvious discussion here. Okay, so we will begin with the beginning with Aristotle. So before we engage in a discussion of Aristotle's notion of mimesis, so miming, right? Mimesis in the Greek sense of the word, and the concept of composition of things, in Greek, systasiston pragmaton, as deployed in the Poetics, we should set the stage consisting in the overall approach to the text of Peripoetikes, as the title reads in Greek, or the Poetics. The title implies the presence of the concept of Technē, which is a certain, which is a central term in Aristotle's discussion of what the moderns call art, as Poetikes should be read as an adjective in this title. Thus, it is an examination of the poetic technique, Technē, therefore technique, craftsmanship. In our 21st century, predominantly post-idealist context, it might resonate as debasing to art and artists in particular to hear that creation, artistic creation, is reduced to craft, no different than that of any skill of human creation, any other skill of human creation, even the most banal ones. But did Aristotle think any form of Technē as inferior to what can be put in proximity of philosophy? Not so only as a discipline, but also as a form of human experience, the status it had in Greek antiquity. I argue the opposite. My examinations of Aristotle's rhetoric, the organon, metaphysics, which are, by the way, necessary for a book I'm co-authoring with two colleagues from the UK on the topic of materialism and philosophy, sciences and computing, show that it is a term Aristotle uses to describe a valid logical or scientific philosophical reasoning. So Technē is also a term used to describe a valid logical or scientific reasoning. Syllogike, the Technē of syllogisms would be one of the expressions he would use. I believe in the rhetoric, but it is also the other way around. In Poetics itself, which is a text on art, on tragedy to be more precise, but tragedy is taken as the highest form of art, as we know from the text. So in Poetic itself, Aristotle argues that in the craft of the arts, or for that matter, in any form of craft, actually, we see at work the ability to detect something we will tentatively call structure, and by doing so, abstract it from its material foundation. Going back to the question of setting the stage of the discussion, which we have already done through our short discussion of the status of the notion of Technē in Aristotle's text, I will argue that Aristotle's Poetics is a sterile, but in the best possible sense, and purely formal discussion of how the poetic craft is crafted and thus comes to being. It lives as a living organism. It brings forth lively emotions. It moves the human psyche. And yet, the coming to being of art, or tragedy more specifically, is dismantled in order to study. So this is an explanation of how the text progresses in the text of Aristotle's Poetic, is dismantled in order to study its mechanisms as the only way of explaining how it operates as an organic whole. This is what happens in Aristotle's text. The method resembles, I argue, Saussure's approach to language, whereby the utmost banal mechanicity, phonetic or otherwise, is not only in no contradiction with the organic self-development and branching out of language, and the sensation of it being naturally flowing in use, at least, but rather explains, so this basis of mechanicity actually explains these very possibilities of this natural flow I just spoke about. So Aristotle's core of the argument as to what constitutes tragedy, and thereof art, poiesis in all of its forms, does not lie in the dialectics of emotions and morals, culminating in catharsis, but in what he calls systasis, the standing together of the elements of the tragedy, that consist of movement. So in the elements of tragedy, any tragedy, that consist of movement and change, or drama in Greek, in its etymological sense. Thus, movement. That is, of that which happens, of events. It's a systasis of events in a way. According to the classical interpretation of the poetics, the essence of tragedy is catharsis. Just a second. I thought I lost my connection, but it seems to be all right. So the essence of tragedy is catharsis, pathematon katharsin in Greek. And that section of the text, 49b 21 to 28, is what is habitually treated as the definition of tragedy. On the other hand, there is recurring reference to heton pragmaton systasis in Greek, or the systasis of deeds, things that take place, events again, but it could be also things, pragmata. So systasis of deeds, events, or of things and elements. So there is this recurring reference to systasis ton pragmaton as the ousia, or the true being, substance or essence of tragedy. This recurring reference to the phenomenon of systasis ton pragmaton, which seems to hold the status of the definition of tragedy and poiesis, art, altogether, taken as a whole in its entirety, can be found in the following parts of the poetics. 1450, A15, A32, B22. So this is like a dozen of passages in the poetics. So as you can see, this definition that has been marginalized of tragedy and poiesis in general, arts, you could say, this definition of it as being systasis of elements, events, deeds, or things, has been, even though reoccurring, it has been marginalized in the traditional interpretation of Aristotle in favor of just one line or passage in the text, which defines tragedy as catharsis of passions, of emotions. There is a dissident interpretation of this spot in the text, and the traditional interpretation has been challenged, or the canonical interpretation has been challenged by what was back then socialist, a scholar of what was back then Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. His name was Michal Petruševski. This interpretation, this definition has been challenged by him by offering a dissident paleographic analysis of the original, arguing that by medieval times, and he's quoting the scripts of Ricardinus and Parisinus that draw from a script from the 12th century AD. So in this scrolls based on the in the scripts based on the scroll from the 12th century, he argues that on instead of putting so this must have been some sort of I'm sorry, just a second. This must have been some sort of a scribe's correction of the original text, whereby in the place where systasis ton pragmaton, so this system or standing together of things should have read, one has erroneously reconstructed that passage by introducing pathematon or pathematon catharsin, so catharsis of passions or feelings. The dissident interpretation is presented in a paper that can be read in French as well in a journal called Antiquité Vivante, in an old issue of it published in 1954. So all of this is leading us to the presentation of what we call here the radical diet of automation and animality, or it could be called physicality, it could be called materiality, but I avoid the latter term for the time being, for the sake of this elaboration, which builds on Marx's use of the term the physical and the real instead of the material, which occurs hardly anywhere in his original texts. He uses far more often the physical and the real instead of the material in his own original writings. I'm speaking of Marx. So this will be also an introduction to the notion of the non-human as well. If we are to speak of any form of technē, so the Greek word of technē, which means, as I already said, craft, art, arts in the sense of, in the contemporary sense of the word, but also a technique of, for example, arguing logically on or in a scientific manner. So a rather generic term in Aristotle's use and in the use we are making here of it. So if we are to speak of any form of technē, be it of technology or of arts in the contemporary sense, along this introductory lines into Aristotle, we are to decenter the discussion from human subjectivity and transpose it onto a new epistemic plane, one enabled by what Marx calls third party's perspective. So in order to operate with the term in such a way that is generic and engenders a unified discussion of technology, arts, philosophy within the same line of argumentation, in order to be able to use the term in such a way, we must resort to the method provided by Marx that's called third party's perspective. It is a perspective that mimes the position of the third party, observing and interpreting the surrounding reality. That is what produces Marx's objectivity, argument in favor of objective reasoning, and that is why his objectivism cannot be compared, let alone reduced to the positivist Kant's, for example, version understanding of objectivity or objectivism in a discussion or any form of examination. So, as I said, third party's perspective enables a Marxism-informed gaze in our discussion here. A gaze informed by Marx's original method present in his own writings, not necessarily found in and in all or any of the subsequent tradition of Marxism. So Marxist probably instead of Marxism. So the latter enables a Marxism-informed gaze of rigorous examination, be it poetics or science, that sees human subjectivity objectively, not in the positive sense, as I already said, but quite the opposite. That is, in the sense elaborated by Marx, which I just explained, Zon Rettel, through his notion of the real abstraction, and Ewald Ilienkov's concept of objectivity. This is not to suspend the relevance of human reality or its interests, but rather to transcend anthropocentrism altogether as a classical philosophical atavism. So this serves this goal. There is something that is interpreted as humanism in Marx, and he espouses humanism, but on the and I call it elsewhere radical humanism. But on the other hand, this form of radical humanism is in fact premised on the moving away of anthropocentrism, of decentering his discussion from the anthropocentric view, or what we might sum up as subjectivity-centered thinking, which he identifies as problematic, or maybe the key problem in Hegel's philosophy, that keeps him, according to Marx, trapped both in idealism and philosophy, as well as it does to his followers that claim to espouse the materialist traditions, such as Feuerbach, for example. So this is not to suspend the relevance of human reality or its interest, but rather to transcend anthropocentrism altogether as a classical philosophical atavism, as well as overcome the naivete of the anthropomorphic full automation eschaton, or the eschaton of technology and its anthropomorphism. Revisiting Aristotle, let us be reminded that the notion of automaton and Technē, the incident or accident, are introduced in physics second book, in Aristotle's physics the second book, only to be taken up by Lacan, such that the latter refers to the real and the symptom, and the former to the signifying chain, the pleasure principle, or the signifying automaton. Let us present the notion now of the radical diet of the non-human. So it enables us to speak of humanity, to construe an account of humanity, of collectivities, of social realities, however, along a certain continuum that is not organized in line with what Marx might call subjectivity-centered thinking. So just a second, I'm sorry, I have a little doggy here that's interrupting the talk. this will take just 1 second. Okay, sorry. That's when you have a new puppy in your home. Okay, so we were at the continuum of the non-human, understood as this radical dyad I was speaking of until the short interruption. Okay. So let us present the notion of the radical dyad of the non-human, one that will serve us to imagine subjectivization in less human subjectivity-centered terms. It is an attempt to think radical humanity in terms of Marxian materialism, which is the product of approaching Karl Marx's writings on the real and the physical. These are terms, as I said, he uses, by way of Francois Laruelle's non-philosophical method. We are resorting here to the terms of the physical and the real as the designations that appear in Marx's text far more often than the material, most probably due to his critique of the materialism of his time as yet another form of idealism. As he argues, such as the one he finds in Feuerbach, conditioned by their inability to move away from philosophy. That is his explicit argument there. Yet again, they do not serve to designate biology or living matter. Only they do not serve to designate biology or living matter only, but also the natural environment, the use value as well of manufactured objects. So the use value itself of the practice of use. So that too can be marked with the terms of the physical, the real, the sensuous that Marx uses. As or in the sense of the material as we use it now. So they serve to designate, they do not serve to designate biology or living matter only, but also the natural environment, the use value of manufactured objects, and so on. In short, everything physical in the sense of the material that we operate with nowadays in philosophy, at least. Unlike post-humanism, inspired by critical theory and the method of post-structuralism, the theory of the non-human as a radical dyad of technology in the generic sense of the word, ranging from the Technē of speaking a natural language to AI technology, and the organic understood as physicality. So this radical dyad does away with anthropocentrism. Moreover, it does away with anthropomorphology of thought. That is, it is a doing away of any theorizing or philosophy that is centered on the notion of human subjectivity, or to borrow a Laruellian term, any posture of thought that is molded according to the structure of subjectivity-centered thinking, even if the semantics may differ. Marx also operates with the notion of the real, oftentimes simultaneously with that of the physical. I have approached the concept found in Marx by means of Laruelle's suspension of the principle of philosophical sufficiency. That is, by way of exiting the vicious cycle of philosophy legitimizing philosophy, and in that process positing and recreating the real as existent, non-existent, relevant, irrelevant, as well as what is real and what is an illusion. I have elaborated this proposal at more detail elsewhere in a book that Amanda mentioned in the introduction, published in 2019. And in that process, I was aided by Ferdinand de Saussure's structuralist linguistics, Luis Irigary's feminism, read of subjectivity-centered discussion, and inspired by Marx's theory of commodity fetishism, as well as by John Malarkey's reworking of Laruelle's human in human as the non-human. Laruelle, not unlike Marx, argues that the thought that seeks to transcend the circularity of philosophy needs to submit to the real. But in order to do so, it must abolish the very possibility of relationality between the two, between the real and thought. Thus, one avoids the error of amphibology, of substituting truth for the real and the other way around, arriving at a unity of the two, whereby what is real must also be true and vice versa. The post-philosophical or non-philosophical thought must mime the scientific posture of thought, whereby the thought submits to the always already foreclosed real, but this ontological foreclosure does not prevent the thought from seeking to clone the real. The real is not a substance. It is not an ontological modifier, the real is not a substance, it is an ontological modifier, or rather an epistemic category. It is in this sense that it is also the one. The unilaterality posited, it is also in this sense that it is the one, and now I'm explaining why it is the one. The real works as the one. The unilaterally posited elements of the dyad, so the dyad of the automaton and the physical in the non-human. So we are discussing here subjectivization, but not on an individual level, but on the level of this continuum of two planes, where subjectivization could be collective, could take place in plural. So the unilaterally posited elements of the dyad, of the automaton and the physical, lead to the latter, to the physical, that is, mechanically producing sense, following the model of Saussure's language, both as langue in French and langage. Drawing on Yuhu's distinction between mechanicity and organicity, let us note that under our Laruelle-Marx-inspired lens, the two categories are not mutually exclusive. And in the present elaboration of the radical dyad, that is the non-human, they are actually a continuum of two elements that enable one another, mechanicity and organicity. They form a sort of a movie strip, let's say. So mechanicity is used here in the sense of Technē, a craft of device making, of art and artificiality, as in artifice creation. Thus, it could be, for example, the craft of creating and practicing language, natural language, human natural languages, but also artificial, for that matter. So I do not make recourse to it in a sense encumbered with an ontology or metaphysics of mechanistic causality, neither in the Cartesian sense nor as a notion opposed to and in mutually excluding relation with the notion of organicity. It refers to the materiality of the practice of signification, conceived in the Saussurean sense. A phoneme gains meaning through its practically mechanical distinction, relation in square quotes to another phoneme, whereas the one serves merely to prefer. So I know it sounds confusing, so I will reformulate it. So a phoneme gains meaning through its distinction from relation to another phoneme, but in a very material sense. A is not B, for example. Or a vowel relates to another vowel in that or that way. And now the phoneme that relates to the other phoneme serves, so the one exact signification enacts production of signification, produces a trace, let's say, signifies, but the other phoneme prefers mere material distinction to the other. So it acts as if the real to this intentionality to signify. So the other phoneme acts like the real. So there is no duality, there is no dualism, there is no binary that makes sense insofar as binary or a unity of two. It remains a radical dyad. And this radical dyad and or its radicality is enabled precisely by this mechanicity or materiality, coarse materiality, let's put it that way, in which mechanical processes take place. So the choice of a phoneme, according to Saussure, is completely arbitrary. The other phoneme is in the binary, serves as a negation, only in the sense I just described, or as Schelling's Hemmung, hindrance, referred to here as as to an analogy rather than a fully adequate definition of the matter in question. Okay, so certain material characteristics are required in the Saussurian account of phonetics in order for the process of signification to commence and be maintained. They're contingent upon the phonetic system in its most material sense. The relation of the two phonemes is a non-relation, as I just said, since relationality, philosophically conceived, seems to imply intentionality. And there is no mutual intentionality in what I just described. The sounds are senseless, random audio creations that begin to make sense only after the preconditions of material rules of sound grouping are met. And on this basis of a material distinction from another sound or group of sounds is made. In spite of the fact that Saussure's minimal structure is a binary, the binarity in question is neither dualism nor duality in any philosophical sense. It is similar, in fact, to Francois Laruelle's radical dyad. That's why we took recourse to it, so that we explain the radical dyad through this comparison. So it is similar to Francois Laruelle's radical dyad, a concept of duality that comes down to unilaterality. The two elements are positioned to one another as the indifferent, numb, and senseless real is to thought. So at the level of the non-human, the same takes place between the automaton of signification and the physical basis. This that remains radical. There is no unification. There is some grounding alienation there that needs to be affirmed. And it needs to be affirmed in its material sense as well. If we accept the thesis that the human is a radical hybrid of physicality on the one hand and language or signification enabling subjectivization on the other hand, the physical, insofar as devoid of language, plays the role of the real at the heart of the said dyad. This founding estrangement is never sublated or transcended through some philosophical unification, but rather affirmed, and thus the dyad is radicalized. Thought seeks to relate to the real, relay it, inevitably transposing it onto the level of the transcendental, whereby the real remains foreclosed, indifferent. Laruel's preferred concept here is thought instead of the thinking subject, as it refers to the material reality or the practice of thought that would be unnecessarily anthropomorphized by the introduction of the notion of subject. In other words, the intentionality to signify of one of the phonemes or morphemes is hampered by the other opposing phoneme or morpheme, and thereby made possible by the very limit or the real of the other sign, be it phoneme or a written trace. The unilateral relation within a binary conceived in structuralist terms and developed along the lines of Laruel's method of dualysis, a procedure of unilateralization pertaining to the radical dyad, can be compared but not reduced to Schelling's notion of heming, as I already said, as discussed by Yuk Hui in his recursivity and contingency. And that leads the automation of signification or information to return, revisit, and overcome the hampering in order to proceed with the circular process of signification. The radical dyad is radical insofar as it remains a dyad, precluding any sublation, synthesis, or unification. Each of the elements operate unilaterally via one another, remaining one faced by a foreclosure, and therefore remaining one faced by a foreclosure, and therefore acting as the real toward one another. The one of the elements is not the other. So there is no need of romanticization of the relation that is not even a relation within this dyad, because there is no relationality or intentionality here. The one of the two elements is not the other to the other element, because the other prefers meaning, and the subject and the other unified in a truth that surpasses the split. So the subject necessarily would unify this dyad, preferring truth that surpasses the split we are talking about here. Even if this unity is declared to be a paradox, it's still some sort of claim to unity, even though a paradoxical one. Meaning and making sense can happen only within the automation of making sense of language, of any form of signifying automaton, be it natural, be it artificial. In order to establish the automaton, the material preconditions of the radical dyad ought to be established as well. It is therefore an artifice, a mechanical design, and such is the dyad itself between the automaton or the automation of making sense or language on the one hand, and physicality of the body, practice and material experiences of the non-human on the other hand. The latter refers to the human stripped of its philosophical edification and thereby underdetermined in Laruelian sense, defined in its last and least humanity. An operation of this sort exposes the radical dyad humanity is. It is the artifice of the signifying automaton, thought, and the projection of subjectivity on the one hand, and the numb and coarse reality of human physicality or animality on the other hand. As already noted, I've elaborated this thesis elsewhere. The book I already mentioned, and Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, where I also establish a homology between this understanding of the notion of the non-human and Donna Haraway's cyber. And they are comparable. And I argue that her cyber is also, or ought to be read also as a radical dyad. So according to such a postulation of non-humanity and in line with Marxist realism or materialism and its orthodox legacy, the non-human remains an so the human, right? The post-human, but here we call it non-human for the reasons already explained at the beginning. And also because we detach ourselves from the post-structuralist epistemic paradigm. So the non-human remains an artifice, a product of Technē, inside of which a unity enabled by a certain organicity remains impossible. The automaton of signification and the automaton of physis, nature, because that too functions as automaton, we can extrapolate automata in physis as well, inevitably establish a certain instance of organicity, and respectively so. And I'm making this argument again in line with Hui's interpretation of organicity. So the edifice, the human is, however, is a philosophical and idealist creation, in the sense of the equation between philosophy and idealism established by Marx, and later on appropriated and refashioned by Laruelle, in particular in Introduction to Non-Marxism. So the radical materialist or non-Marxist in the sense of non-philosophical Marxism, determination of the dyad affirms the materiality or the physicality and reality in the sense of Marx's original writings of the dyad itself, of a binary unit that is never unified, and of the sense of a split or estrangement at the heart of the non-human, to affirm and embrace materiality, physicality, expressed as experience that is somatic, of that founding, let me reread this, to affirm and embrace the materiality, physicality expressed as experience that is somatic, of that founding estrangement, entails the affirmation of the real abstraction alienation is, both socially and on the level of subject formation. I don't know if there is still time. I have one closing paragraph. Okay, I will end in a minute. So I argue that a Marx-inspired materialism necessitates the affirmation of the reality of that originary estrangement of the non-human. I also argue that philosophy has always been in an obsessive search to cover up the traces of the embarrassing coarse reality of the radical dyad the non-human is. The embarrassment at issue engenders the philosophical reflex toward elevation into a unity that surpasses the dyad, toward transformation of the human into an idea, and thereof toward doing away with it altogether and its embarrassing remnants of animality or physicality uninhabited by thought. I argue that this obsession of philosophy underpins its entire history and culminates in the worldview of modernity and by consequence in the capitalist reason itself. Philosophy in its post-enlightenment form and the political economy of capitalism are two sides of the same coin, the world as we know it is. In other words, we must address the metaphysics of capitalism if we want to address its political economy, which in turn is the prerequisite of tackling the problem of climate crisis that includes the threat to the survival of the life on this planet, folding in non-humanity, the animals and other forms of life. So I'm done here.
Okay, thanks so much, Katerina. I'm just jumping in quickly to invite Alice to, I think you're going to present some work today, Alice, as well as talk. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to present alongside Katerina and respond to that really insightful paper. So today I'll present a short reading, bringing together some of my thoughts in response to reading Katerina's work on art, materialism, and philosophy, and introduce my film Woven Earth's Time Body, which I began making around the same time I started reading and writing non-philosophy and philo-fiction as part of my artistic practice. So after that, yeah, I'm going to then read a kind of a list poem that I made of terms that relate to our respective work, and then screen the film, which has a soundtrack but no dialogue. So Woven Earth's Time Body is made from fragments of existing footage and sounds gathered, first in London in 2013, when I had just begun writing my PhD at the London Graduate School, exploring how non-standard philosophy could be used or lend its modeling to art practice, a practice of making and thinking as art. Since that time, the film has been added to using original footage filmed on location in Sierra Leone, where my dad comes from, and it continues to be added to as a work in process. So from the beginning, this work sought to explore ideas of mimesis and looping, both in terms of technology and in terms of visual storytelling, thinking about the body through time, its relation to the earth, and particularly how the earth and the body are narrated or retold through visual representations of archaeology and geology, respectively. I was interested in how fiction, in particular science fiction, made use of this technology-based language of representation, a visual language of science or facticity, to create rich and credible narratives about other worlds. So some of the footage in the film is taken from homemade Mars landing reconstructions and pieces of subjective image analysis from conspiracy theorists and YouTubers. Another section of footage shows an alien mummy autopsy. It claims to prove aliens have been with us since antiquity. And the soundtrack is made of layered loops sampled from planetarium videos. So the music that plays while graphics map the universe to paying customers. Okay, so what the work is trying to do speaks a lot to what I was reading when I made it. So how an artistic practice can become a kind of processing center for philosophical concepts, but also how it can take those concepts and repurpose them for its own uses. So this kind of being the technology of our practice. And thinking about the body, experience, time, and re-representation, and non-philosophy's conception of the non-human as radical dyad, this both subject, object, object, subject, physical and conceptual, that remain ununified but co-present with each other. And this kind of unlimited definition of what the human can be or the non-human. So kind of trying to press through that and through these kind of limiting definitions that have been historically hierarchized and excluded different categories being to a much more expansive theory that makes room for the future, and one that opens up questions about positionality, stance, and posture of its past narrators. So really kind of questioning the kind of positionality of those that defined what the human was previously. So thinking about the kind of biography of philosophy and philosophical history, as Lara would think about it. So on reading Katerina's abstract and previous work relating to the subject of art and philosophy, materialism, that informed my own research and practice at the time the film was made, I began to think about this practice of treating philosophy as an art material equal to any other, so equal to clay or paint, video clips, or whatever your materials are, and that kind of reaching into philosophical history also as a kind of an archaeology, or perhaps a kind of a forensics or a reconstruction of lost worlds from a single feature in an otherwise unknowable landscape. The exaggeration of a series of marks, that is language, that indicates thought once happened here. Uncovering a figure in the dirt, noting signs of struggle, processes of extraction, refinement, and clarification, distinguishing meaning from non-meaning, truth from fiction, and knowing they are not so easily separated. I connect this gesture or approach to thought and making with what Francois Laruelle and Francois Schmidt have described as philo-fiction, and consider this film as a kind of a philo-fiction that can act in response to the body of Katerina's work, but also an exploration of the physical, of poetics, of catharsis, and indeed tragedy. So thinking through the film, its origins and the conceptual framework of Katerina's project, I put together a list of words that indicate what I see as a shared conceptual constellation. Like a visit to the planetarium, I will read these like the names of stars, mapping out an area of the sky from a very particular position on the earth. The poem will act as a bridge between the two presentations, and the film will follow immediately after. Bodies, being, histories, sciences, fictions, recursive, looping, timelines, model, figures, burial, riverbed, mapping, enmeshed, entangled, faded, coded, retold, additives, Technē, telos, thanos, mimesis, one, unified, equalized, lowered, replica, remote, remade, reconstitute, edit, excavate, narrative, object, subject, object, third, position, view, future, imagined, cyborg, automaton, golem, ontos, child of clay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alice. That was extremely thought-provoking, especially in relation to Katerina's presentation. I'm wondering if, yeah, we could all come back together and maybe use this time to open up some of these questions or relations between what both of you have presented. And I know, Alice, you know, you obviously did construct a response to Katerina's work, but maybe in keeping with what Katerina's been proposing, what you also put forward is another thing to think about, like as a discrete possibility. And I think this is something very interesting because almost methodologically, it falls in line with what some of Katerina's been speaking to today. I'm wondering if I could just kick off with one question, maybe for both of you. And I call this tentatively a question because I've only just heard your presentation. So I'm jumping in with this kind of feeling. And I wanted to maybe just invite you to talk, if possible, about something that Katerina first spoke about at the beginning, which is this question of the tragic or the realm of tragedy. And you talked about redealing the space of tragedy as not the space of redemptive human catharsis, this kind of space for us and about us necessarily, but a space of structures. And this is how I was reading it anyway, Katerina. You can tell me if I've misunderstood this, right? So in one sense, what you made me, you conjured this kind of thought in my head, or this image in my head, Katerina, and I couldn't help but imagine a playwright, like an artist, when you were talking. And I was thinking, oh, right, there's a playwright, and they're writing a tragedy. How do they structure, you know, structural thinking here? So, and in the structure of tragedy, at least we can say that one of the kind of primary ways to acknowledge a tragedy is occurring is that there's two orders that collide, that are irreconcilable, and, you know, and that produces irony, dramatic irony, all kinds of conditions of the incommensurability of the moment when these two laws or orders are appearing almost in the same space at the same time, but there's this kind of like irresolution. So when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the playwright making this tragedy up, and I was thinking this is really interesting because what you made me think of is that you have a play and you have the structure inside the play, but also the play has to be put on in a theatre, right? So you have the theatre and you're performing your play. And so as a playwright, you might be also thinking about the condition of your foot in the world, let's say, your foot in the world beyond the play, the audience of the play, of course, who the tragic. And this invites the question, of course, this is what I think you're making me think of here, Katerina, is this doubling of the space of these structures. So you have this two orders inside the tragic, let's say, inside the play, and then the play takes place in a world that somehow doubles up on this production of structures. And on the one hand, the playwright could say, well, I anticipate my audience needing this because they might be idealists and want catharsis, right? And so I can write a play that panders to my audience. But on the other hand, the very idea of the audience is a kind of unknowability, like it's the outside of the play. So given all this, I kept thinking about, well, you know, what is the kind of transcendental position here? And how is it that tragedy is a structure that can avoid this pandering to the given? And if I say the given, I'm referring to the ideations of standard philosophy that you want to reject, right? So I wondered about that, like the material conditions of our expectations, like in an everyday sense, right? So that's one question. And then maybe something that relates very much, I hope, to Alice's presentation. I was wondering about, like, Alice, what was very profound for me when I was watching your work and listening to you speak, was how a lot of the camera work in your piece was top down, like it was plan view and looking down on something, not all of it, but quite a lot. And even when it wasn't, it was very, as you were saying, it had this scientific eye, let's say, this inquisitive curiosity. And in many ways, not only does the camera take on this transcendental position, but the material that we're looking at takes on this figure of alterity, like it's like alien material. So we have in your work, I think, you can disagree with me, we have in your work, I think, this very interesting vectors of two aleatory positions, you know, two outsides. And so the structure, I'm wondering how that structure, these kind of aesthetics of the transcendental, let's say, and then the taking the place or the site of the transcendental with the camera eye, give us a sense of particular structures at work there, like certain orders that are being manifest through fiction as objective configurations in the world that give, like, make us do things, right? They force us to behave in certain ways. And so I was very interested in about, like, the structure of the tragedy in the world, you know, as a thing in the world, but also how this structure in your work, Alice, appeals to maybe a different articulation of structures. And I guess I would love you to both tell me more about, you know, Alice, do you feel that your work has anything to do with the structure of the tragic? And Katerina, do you think that the same about Alice? Or I just wondered about these transcendental positions and the structures that are being produced in your work that have force and do some work of controlling, but also this idea of opening to unknowability, right? I hope that makes some sense.
Yes, of course it does. Okay, first of all, it is important to underscore that when Aristotle discusses tragedy, he discusses art making in general. There are passages where he says this can apply to vase painting or other forms of poiesis. He simply chooses tragedy as a model of analysis, a model that provides sufficient material, especially because of its status of superiority in Greek antiquity, to analyze upon it the way art creation, so poiesis, operates, and what its key elements, or what its definition is, and what makes a certain artwork successful, what makes the art good art, let's say, let's put it in that way. Tragedy is simply just one art form chosen for a more general discussion. That is what I'm trying to say here. Now, Aristotle admits that the tragedy has elements of rhetoric, as he puts it. Rhetoric seeks to convey certain messages of morals of the day, etc., etc. But all of that is unimportant compared to the craft of putting together of the elements. Now, there is a structuring law, and also, I guess, a certain message, I would say, that every tragedy seeks to send out to the society, which is in fact not even provocative, or does not seek to provoke the order of things. Quite the opposite, I would say. And the morals of the given day of that era, quite to the opposite, I would say. And Bakhtin says the same thing, and Jean-Pierre Vernant as well. It serves, in fact, to by putting the world upside down, to in fact reinforce the social order in place. I'm sorry, the puppy. Isidora, може да го вземеш, Макс? I'm sorry. Non-human intervention, and in my response. Just a second. So in fact, the function of the tragedy is that one. So what happens in tragedy is the following. This is the only thing that is important. So you can forget about the semantic content of this, let's say, structural cornerstone of every tragedy. What matters is that this cornerstone is there, and this is what makes a tragedy tragedy. And that is the following: in every tragedy, there has to be hubris. So the challenge of the moral order, a challenge sent out to the gods. There should be human hubris vis-a-vis the immortals or the gods. The gods, of course, represent the moral order of the time. So if there is hubris, and if this hubris is committed not intentionally, so again, you do not have a subject that is evil or good. It's he or she, or they are not endowed with any intention whatsoever. It is again merely a structural element. This subject ought to commit an error that is, in fact, that could, in fact, be an honest mistake. Let's put it that way. But that error betrays, nonetheless, this hubristic ambition in the tragic hero. And it is important to note that Aristotle does say explicitly the hero of a tragedy is neither good or bad. He or she or they do not have a moral definition. And the error, or the hamartema, I'm sorry, is committed as mere error, as accident. So that is also important. It's a touche in the automaton of the city, of the Greek polis, of the Athenian polis, and it disrupts the polis, or the order, and the social contract and the morals of the time. So once that happens, there is a reversal in the tragedy. Of course, there is this downfall of the hero. After the downfall, if you recall the Greek tragedy, there is no reconciliation, there is no consolation, there is nothing. We just witness the error and the tragic fall. That's it. So the very reminder of this possibility of in every human being's life. The very reminder, the tragedy is that this could happen to an individual or a collective or a polis, is the only role that tragedy has in a Greek polis. So that is why it is also very structural inside of itself, and as far as its role within the Greek city-state polis is concerned. So that is why the composition of elements is relevant, so that we witness something that is believable, and it is enabled through structural means, through the very craft of putting together a tragedy. It becomes believable. So therefore, the plot is key in tragedy, according to Aristotle, and everything else, characters, morals that literally morals, like, you know, small moral messages sent out to the audience, etc. All of that is considered ornamental and secondary in Aristotle. So according to him, this should be the law of any good art, not just tragedy. So
thanks, Katerina. I guess
structure in that sense.
Just before Alice talks, I guess just to explain, I think that's why I was really interested in talking about Alice's work as these lenses of exteriority, you know, whether it's the thing depicted or the camera, because what you're talking about is in the narrative of tragedy, one needs the situation where something happens to someone. There is an outside force. And I guess that's what led to my question, or my wonderings around this question of the aleatory. And also which led to my point about, you know, the fact that the audience might on the one hand be taken as a given, which is like kitsch, tragedy. But if you take the world in which the artwork lives within as another exteriority, and how does that kind of relate to the work, becomes another question of this kind of this aleatory condition. So Alice, do you have anything to say about, I know we have to finish in just a couple of minutes, but I'd love to hear from you.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about as Katerina was answering was this idea of the thing being put together, and that kind of precisely talks to this, the idea of the edit, and like the actual, the technique of bringing together a film like what I showed, and this idea of, in a way, because the objective perspective keeps being interrupted by yet another equally objective or equally powerful kind of perspective, in a sense that actually creates the undermining of that objectivity, and like reveals the partiality of the perspective. So this kind of God's eye is constantly being interrupted by another God, and in that way the narrative is kind of constructed through interruption and through a kind of an underscoring of the partiality of perspectives, and particularly thinking about how we narrativize ourselves and our histories, and how we narrativize the planet. So really kind of thinking about the kind of fiction of ecology, and how we kind of relate that into our past, and how this, particularly this idea of the earth and unearthing, and how we treat the kind of the body of the earth, were all very, very kind of important and interesting to me, and how that is kind of imaged. And then the kind of agency of me as an artist, kind of bringing together kind of found footage, and then interweaving that with my own subjective, extremely partial lens of the kind of original footage, and how that those, I guess each of those positions are indistinguishable and form a single part form a single voice in the film, but are in fact a kind of a chorus. So kind of those ideas of voice, and then that the work itself doesn't have a narrative, it's introduced, but it itself is a kind of it's just got music, and that kind of creates this kind of potential for projection as well. So there's this kind of that it sort of extracts itself from kind of a written language and a verbal language as well. But yeah, I mean, we don't have loads of time, so I won't go on too much. But yeah, I think. Well,
actually, Alice, someone has asked a question. I'd love to just. I know we might go over 2 minutes, but I'd love to ask you this question, Alice. Your film includes a strong visual of the malleability of clay. Do you agree that the nature of the material is as important as how it appears in the end as an object? So this is a kind of really interesting question about, let's say, materiality, process, and figure, perhaps, which is something that Katerina was also referring to in her paper. But yeah, Alice, what do you think?
Well, a lot of the footage of the clay is also the clay at different stages, like it being like raw and in the ground. And then one of the kind of later pieces is actually it being processed. And this idea of something having to be kind of fashioned. And then again, kind of I kind of infer this idea of the golem and the child of clay and this kind of making ourselves from the earth. And yeah, I mean, for me, clay is a very, very important part of my sculptural practice, but then also kind of how we see clay and the kind of footage of clay is also an important thing. And thinking about the malleability of the material, yeah, I mean, it's intrinsic to being able to kind of tell a story through it. And it is inherently like personal and partial and subjective as a kind of a, yeah, and doesn't try to be in any other way. There's no cover up in that kind of way. Thinking about this idea of the cover up and the conspiracy theory was something I really enjoyed and connected with. In philosophy's kind of activity, it also kind of made me think a little bit about the grand narrativization of human history and also of the planet.
I guess, again, one last thing, I can't help it because it's so interesting. I guess it also refers to the what do our material resources or even conceptual resources allow us to do, you know? And I think, Katerina, you know, you make me wonder about that as well in what you've spoken about today, like this question of this question of limits in relation to this malleability of the world that we live in, but also this question of what orders that we've invented for ourselves, but also exist outside of us that bring us to certain kind of limit questions as well. So I'm going to have to stop there because we have gone a little bit over, but I just want to thank the whole audience for watching. I want to especially thank Katerina for taking the time to construct such an amazing paper and to walk us through deeply through these amazingly like deft and intricate ideas that you're crafting with your work. And thank you so much to Alice for showing up today and sharing your work with us, because there's an amazing kind of imbrication of your works. And I'd love also, if we ever got the chance to do it again in the future, to explore that a lot more. So thank you both for talking today. Thanks for everyone coming. And we'll see you on March the 17th at noon, West Side time. And have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Alice.